This is kind of awkward, I have to admit, because it's the first time we're meeting each other, and as I was praying over these readings to prepare for this homily, all I could think about was suffering. So I was like, they're going to think I'm a really morose type of person. But maybe it's because I thought I would try to console you in the absence of all the anguish you're going from not having Father Mosier with you. Or maybe this is my own desperate public cry for help, one of the two. But I couldn't get away from this question. Have you encountered Jesus Christ in the very place of your greatest suffering, whether in the past or in the present? One of my favorite saints, the saint who really brought me back to the Catholic Church when I'd fallen away in college, was Saint Padre Pio. He had the stigmata, so he bled for 50 years from his wounds in his hands, feet, and side. Every time he celebrated the Mass, it'd be about 3 hours long, because he could actually see, it was 3 hours long because he could actually see the host transforming into Christ, into his body, the wine transforming into his blood. He could see the angels around the altar. When people would come to him for confession, he could read their souls, tell them what they hadn't told priests in years. And so people were coming to him from all over in the 20th century in San Giovanni Rotondo to ask for prayers and to witness the miracles that he would perform. But most of all, they went for healing. And many people he cured from cancer, from blindness, from tumors, deformities, all sorts of healings. But one story has always kind of stayed with me the most. And it was the story of a man who actually lived in the same village as Padre Pio in San Giovanni Rotondo for like 30 years. And when he was younger, he was at work, in his 20s, and there was an explosion that went off next to him. And it blinded him. He lost his sight. And it also deformed his hands, so he could no longer perform the same work that he was doing before. So he became impoverished. And for some 20 years, he was living in that state. And he lived in the same village as St. Padre Pio. Would talk to him, go to his masses, go into confession to him all the time. And one time he was sitting next to Padre Pio, and St. Padre Pio asked him, just kind of said to him, you've never asked me for a cure before. Think about it. It's kind of like if you're in prison and you're best friends with the president who comes to see you and says, you've never really asked me to help get you out of here. Like, I know people. Padre Pio is pretty much just fishing it out to him. And the response of the man is something I've never forgotten. He said, "This suffering was the hardest thing to ever happen to me. My life would have been so much easier without it. But if it didn't happen, I would never know Jesus the way I know him now. So why would I ask for it to be taken away?" So he recognized that the suffering in his life was the very thing that enabled him to have such a profound relationship with Jesus Christ. And because of that, his suffering was transformed. And that's the thing. When we experience Jesus Christ in the very place of our suffering, he alone has the power to transform it. Suffering's always bad. It's never good in itself. But only Jesus Christ encountering us there can change it into another thing. He can change it into an encounter with himself. And essentially that's the meaning of the cross, right? The crucifix. God meeting us in the very place of our chaos, of our desolation, transforming it into love. Most people, when they see a crucifix, all they see is a tragedy. We see God loving us even unto death. Most people, when they look at their lives, at the sufferings they've experienced, they just see a tragedy. That blind man saw his greatest suffering as the very place of God's deepest revelation to him. So we can always go two ways with our suffering. In a sense, that's what takes place in today's readings. Christ reveals himself to a people who are living in a land of gloom. Isaiah says, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light." Zebulun and Naphtali, these are at the very top points of Israel, right? And after the Babylonian exile, when the Babylonians came and destroyed all of Israel, they were hit some of the hardest than anyone, and they were never rebuilt after the fact. Right? So after the exile, they just became a land of gloom, scattered, divided amongst themselves, confused on how to go forward. It's like sometimes the same thing can happen to us in life. It's like life can hit us so hard that even after the storm passes, we don't know how to rebuild. Right? But it was in that very place, Zebulun and Naphtali, was the very first place Jesus Christ went to begin his public ministry. And I think there's a very deep significance of maybe it's when we find Christ in the very places of our exile, of our confusion, of our doubts, of our weaknesses. That's where the beginning of our relationship with him really takes place. And he comes with one message: repent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Come, follow me. And let's break that down. The meaning of the word repent, we usually just think of actions like sackcloth and start scourging yourself and praying for forgiveness. But it actually has to do much more with the mind. Repent comes from the Greek word metanoia. Meta means above and beyond. Noia means mind. So it's almost like a transcendence of thought. To change your perspective. To change the way that you're seeing reality. It's like that saying, if you change the way that you're looking at things, the things that you look at change. So it's really a challenge to change their perspective on how they're seeing their situation right now. And that's why it's so important for us to consider, how do I perceive my own life? What's my story that I tell myself, my history? How do I perceive my present? Have the things I've suffered been the place of God's deepest revelation? Or have they merely been places of desolation? Because that's the great danger of suffering, right? It can paralyze us. Suffering has the potential to turn us to stone, to where we can never move past it, right? That's the whole figure of Medusa in Greek mythology. Medusa, that crazy woman with the snakes coming out of her head, she represented pure chaos, suffering. And the idea was that if you look too close into her eyes, if you gaze upon her too long, she'll turn you to stone. And that's what suffering can do to us in life. One moment, one event can change us forever. Once a woman told me that, it's always been a warning for me in a sense. She said how she lost her older sister in an automobile accident when she was a teenager. But her father was so broken by that event that he never again told his children that he loved them, right? Because it was too hard. And so he allowed that suffering to harden his heart for the rest of his life. And that's no small thing, because that can happen to any of us with the difficulties that we go through in life. And that's why it's so necessary for us to discover Jesus Christ in the very place of our suffering, not on the other side of it. Because he's the only way that we're able to get through it. No other religion has a theology of suffering. No other religion has God coming to us in the very place of the cross to bring us redemption. And it's something we don't utilize enough as Christians. To understand that the great problem of suffering in life and in the world is Jesus Christ encountering us right there and transforming it with his presence. That's why the very next words, what does he say? Repent, change the way that you're seeing reality. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Well, what's the kingdom of heaven? Christ himself. God in the flesh. In other words, he's saying, change the way that you're looking at your situation, because I, who am God, the one that you're longing for, the one that you're made for, I'm coming to you right here in the place of your exile. Now come, follow me. And he's the one that leads us through that suffering. That's why so often the answer to our problems in life is not analyzing the problem itself. Like analyzing yourself, like what's wrong with me? I talked to a woman, she went to a psychologist for like 15 years, talking about all the things she'd gone through in her life, in her childhood. And she said, the way she wasn't a Christian, so she was just telling me her experience. She said it felt like every time I'd go there, I'd get cut open, and I'd see all the things that were wrong with me, and they'd give me like a self-help book and send me on my way, like never sewing me up. It's because it's not about knowing what's wrong with us as much as knowing what the answer is to what's wrong. And the answer is always Jesus Christ. So it's not so much about analyzing ourselves or analyzing what's wrong with my marriage or what's wrong with my work or my life or my church. It's changing from what I'm looking at to really who I'm looking at. Do I see Jesus Christ in the very midst of the chaos, coming to me in the very place of breakdown? If you think about it, the Israelites, when they were in the desert, right, they were bit by the serpents. Again, you can understand that as the sufferings that happen in the desert of exile. Well, God didn't say to them, look at your wounds. He said, look at the serpent raised up on the staff, and you will live. And then Jesus Christ, when he came, said, I am that serpent. And anyone who looks at me when I am raised up on the cross, they will live. Because when we look at Christ hanging on the cross for love of us in the very place of our suffering, what doesn't die is our heart. The suffering that we encounter won't break us down to the point where we can't move past it. And I think that's the greatest sign of grace. Suffering always has within it the temptation to flee, to wish our lives were another way, another time, another place. Grace fills us with a renewed sense of wonder and hope of my life as it is, where I'm at, with all I've gone through in the present moment. That's why one of my favorite movies is, It's a Wonderful Life. I think it reveals this more than anything else. I hope it's not too late to quote a Christmas movie, but my parishioners know I never get through an entire homily without bringing up some movie image, because I'm a millennial, so I don't read books, and I'm only 32 years old, so I don't have enough life experience to talk about my own story, so I go to movies. But to me, it's one of the greatest signs of what grace does to our life. Everyone's seen It's a Wonderful Life, right? You're not a true Catholic if you've never seen It's a Wonderful Life. Right? It's like the 8th sacrament of the church. But one of the things, George is a man of constant sorrow, right? He's suffered just one thing, and that's all you're seeing in the movie when you're looking at his life. How one thing after another kind of broke down in his life. And he gets to a point where things just get so hard that he begins to wish that he had never existed. It'd been better if I'd never been born. And he gets the chance to see what his life would have been like if he didn't exist. And hence, he had never suffered. And this is what's so incredible about the film. What are the signs that he receives to realize that he's alive again? What are the signs that he receives to make him understand that he's existed again after that vision? The signs of his suffering. My lips bleeding, Bert. My lips bleeding. Zuzu's petals. Zuzu, there they are. Knowing that he got punched in the face in answer to a prayer. His daughter is sick in bed. He has life insurance policy in his pocket, right? He can't hear out of his left ear again. And the police are waiting for him at home. And yet he rejoices over every single one of these things because he came to see that everything that was wonderful about his life was so intertwined with the things that he had suffered that one could not be separated from the other. And in a way, that's what happens to us when we truly experience Jesus Christ in the very place of our suffering, when we allow him to find us there. Our suffering is transformed into wonder. And nowhere is that more palpable than every single time we as Catholics come to Mass. Because no matter what you're going through in your life right now, outside these doors or in your own heart or in your own mind, the darkness you might be going through, the chaos or the confusion, every single time you come into a Catholic church, into this Mass, Jesus Christ comes to visit us in the very place of our exile, in the midst of the suffering, as he comes to us in the Holy Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity, right before us. And he always comes with the same message. Repent. Change the way that you're perceiving your life. For the kingdom of heaven is at hand, because I'm right here with you every step of the way. Now come, follow me.